Who's there?
It's me. Are you already there?
Yes, we here.
So, did you do it?
No, but we're going to do it soon.
You're still with her?
Yes, I am.
Okay then. See you later.
Bye.
I know it was hard for you to understand what they were talking about. The reason is a linguistic principle called Deixis. Let's have a closer look at it. Deixis means somehow pointing via language. The linguistic forms used for pointing are called deictic expressions or indexicals.
There are three categories of deixis: person deixis, to refer to people; spatial deixis, to refer to locations; and temporal deixis, to refer to time. They all depend on the context shared by the speaker and the hearer. These categories can be subdivided, so a deictic expression can either be near the speaker or away from the speaker. Expressions near the speaker are called proximal terms, and expressions away from the speaker are called distal terms. You will see later what that exactly means.
The concept of distant, already mentioned, is relevant to spatial deixis, where the relative location of people and things is being indicated. Contemporary English makes use of only two adverbs, which are here and there, for the basic distinction. Some verbs of motion, such as come and go, retain a deictic sense when they are used to mark movement towards the speaker, like, for example, come to bed, or away from the speaker, go to bed. One version of the concept of motion toward the speaker seems to be the first deictic meaning learned by children and characterizes the use of words like this and here that can be seen. They are distinct from that and there, which are associated with things that move out of the child's visual space and can no longer be seen. It is important to remember that location from the speaker's perspective can be fixed mentally as well as physically. Speakers seem to be able to project themselves into other locations when uttering the phrase, "I'll come later." This phenomenon is called the deictic projection. But it may be the truly pragmatic basis of spatial deixis is actually the so-called psychological distance. But what is psychological distance? To receive an answer about what this really is, consider the following situation. A woman is sniffing the perfume of a man lying next to her and remarks in a whisper to herself, "I don't like that." Since the man, respectively the perfume, is physically closer to her, it would be more appropriate to use this instead of that, right? The usage of that suggests distance. Physically close objects will tend to be treated by the speaker as psychologically close. Also, something that is physically distant will generally be treated as psychologically distant.
Temporal deictic expressions are used to indicate time. The indexical now is a proximal term, so it's near speaker, and then is a distal term, so it's away from the speaker. Also, then, in contrast to now, applies to both past and future time. For example, "I was in Scotland then" would be past time, and "I'll see you then" would be future time. In turn, the proximal form now can indicate either the time the speaker is making an utterance or the time the listener is hearing the utterance. We also use elaborate systems of non-deictic temporal reference, such as calendar time, for example, on the 22nd of July I was in Berlin, and clock time, for example, back in half an hour. These forms, however, are learned a lot later than those deictic expressions. Yesterday, tomorrow, today, tonight, next week, this week, last week, just to name a few examples. All these expressions depend on knowing the relevant utterance time for their interpretation. Otherwise, we wouldn't know how long we need to wait when we see the sign back in half an hour. By the choice of the verb tense, you can indicate the proximal or distal form. The present tense is the proximal form. The distal past tense form marks something that took place in the past or something that is extremely unlikely or even impossible. Past tense also is used in if clauses for events that are not close to present reality. For example, if I was rich. They even are so distant that they communicate the negative. The person deixis is used to point at people via language. There are three categories: the speaker I, the listener you, and others such as he, she, it, they. Also, there are two special forms of person deixis: the social deixis and the honorifics. Social deixis are forms used to indicate the relative social status. For example, the German Sie indicates that the speaker has a lower social status than the listener. Honorifics are expressions of titles that mark that the addressee is of higher status. For example, your, her, his highness. The third person form communicates distance and non-familiarity. Also, it can have an ironic and humorous touch, as in the question, "Would some highness have some tea?" This form is also used as an accusation, as in, "Somebody did not clean up." Now that you have learned everything about spatial, temporal and person deixis, let's go back to our dialogue from the beginning. It was hard for you to understand what the two were talking about, and you know now that the reason is deixis. So let's identify all the indexicals in the dialogue. Can you find them? Alright, here are the indexicals for spatial deixis. These are the indexicals for temporal deixis. And here are the ones for person deixis. The problem is that we don't know the actual meaning of the indexicals. Only the interlocutors do. This is why we don't really know what they are talking about. I hope I could help you to understand the topic of deixis. Thanks for watching. Bye!
Once explained, it's not very difficult to understand. You wonder what I'm talking about? You didn't understand it because I didn't use reference correctly. This is what we're going to look at today: reference and inference. Reference is when a speaker uses an expression to help the listener to identify what he's talking about. There's no direct connection between entities and words. The words and entities have to be connected by the speaker through the use of reference. But the listener has to infer correctly, which means she or he has to find out the connection the speaker intended when she or he said something. In my example, from the beginning I said, "Once explained, it's not very difficult to understand." Instead of saying it, I should have rather said, "The following topic is not very difficult to understand." The referring expression, "the following topic," is a much clearer referent and makes it easier for you as a listener to infer correctly, meaning to understand what I meant with my sentence. There are different phrases and words one can use as expressions to refer to something else. Definite noun phrases, as the following topic, can be used as referring expressions. Or one can use an indefinite noun phrase, like in this example. Once explained, a linguistic topic is not very difficult to understand. One can also use a pronoun, but you have to be careful, as you have to make sure that the listener knows what you're referring to with the pronoun. Like in my first example, once explained, it's not very difficult to understand. You had no chance of understanding what I was talking about. I didn't give you, as a listener, any context. Better would have been if I said, today we'll talk about reference. Once explained, it's not very difficult to understand. To help you as a listener to understand the intended reference of a pronoun, you can add context to your sentence, or you as a listener look at the context as well. But what is context? Context is the linguistic material surrounding the referring expression you used. Here it would be, today we'll talk about reference. Context limits the possible interpretations of a referring expression for you as a listener. With the context, you now know that it doesn't refer to a game or a mathematical formula, but you know that it stands for the topic reference. Contexts make it easier for the listener to find out the speaker's intended meaning. Another way to understand reference better is when you consider the context in which it is said. Context is the physical environment, like the local knowledge or local social conventions. You are watching this video in order to understand pragmatics better, or while you are at university. Therefore, in this context, you know that you have to expect a tutorial about a pragmatic future. Because of the context you're in, you understand reference as a subtopic of pragmatics. The context you're in influences the reference you use and how you infer as a listener. But let us go back to the referring expressions once more. As you already got to know, indefinite noun phrases can be referring expressions. Indefinite noun phrases can be used to describe a physically present referent, like in "there's a book on the table." Or they can be used to identify a referent that is assumed to exist, as in "he wants to marry a woman with lots of money." Furthermore, they can be used to describe entities that, as far as we know, do not exist. I want to see a fairy one day. If we take a closer look at the example, "he wants to marry a woman with lots of money," depending on referring expressions, it can be an attributive use or a referential use. If the entity, which means the woman, is only known by its descriptive properties, the referring expression is attributive. It means it refers to whoever or whatever fits the description. So the woman he marries can be any woman, as long as she has lots of money. If the speaker actually has a certain woman in mind about whom he is talking, then it's a referential use. Now, to put it in a nutshell, successful reference depends on me as a speaker and my selection of linguistic expressions. My intention is to identify certain entities with the assumption that you as a listener will collaborate and interpret the referring expressions in the way I want you to. In this whole process, different dimensions like the context and the context, and within it the fact that we share the same language and culture, play an important role.
Illusion. What is illusion? If you're thinking it's some type of magic trick or something that appears to be there but is not really there, that's illusion, not illusion. Get rid of this definition. Illusion is a figure of speech where one refers indirectly to texts, events, people, or places. It is left to the reader then to identify what the illusion is referring to. It also gives an extra or deeper meaning to a sentence. That's why it's a figure of speech. If you remember, a figure of speech is where language is used in a non-literal way. So an extra meaning that's not quite literal is given when an illusion is used. There are many types of illusions. There are biblical illusions, so indirect references to the Bible and stories therein. There are historical illusions, so indirect references to historical people or events. There are literary illusions, so indirect references to texts or pieces of literature. There are mythological illusions, so indirect references to myths. And there are cultural illusions, so think music, pop culture, television shows, movies. All those go under cultural illusions. Now, there are many other types of illusions, but these 5 are the most common types. Here's an example of a biblical illusion. It is raining so hard that we are going to need Noah's Ark in order to survive. The Ark is a boat from Noah's flood in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. The rains rained so hard for 40 days that it flooded the whole earth, and only those in the Ark survived. So the idea here is the rain is causing massive flooding, and we can only survive if we have something like Noah's Ark. That's the extra meaning. Example number 2. Historical illusion. I want to be like the president who freed the slaves. So notice it doesn't say his name, but we know it's Abraham Lincoln. And the idea is he helped a lot of people. He did something very important by freeing the slaves and uniting the nation. So he did a lot of important and meaningful actions for the whole nation. So this person is saying they want to do something important and meaningful for the people as well. Now, how do we identify illusions? Well, there's no clear way to identify them. However, in some instances, you can identify clues and phrases that you can look up. For example, if we see something like this, Jim was afraid to fight the bully. He was a real Goliath. Well, that's a clue right there. Goliath. So we can look this up and maybe understand what it is referring to and have a deeper understanding of what's going on. So we can go to Google. So if we Google what is a Goliath, well, we get a result here on the right hand side. It says Goliath of Gath is the biblical giant defeated by the young David in the book of Samuel. So we know it's a biblical illusion. If we go here, it says in the Bible, a giant Philistine warrior who was slain by David with a stone and sling. So now we know it's a biblical illusion and what it's referring to. So we can see that Goliath was a giant from the Bible. He was defeated by a young King David before he became king using a sling and stones. So what we can understand here, it means the bully is very tall and strong, because Goliath was the same way. That's the extra meaning. So in a case like this, we can identify a clue and look it up, and we can have success understanding what the allusion is, even though if we were not familiar with it before. But that's not how it always works with allusions. Look at this one, for example. What governs earth and sea and sky is nothing less than love, whose tight rein, if it ever slackened, would leave creation in chaos, of civil war's utter ruin. From the book The Consolation of Philosophy, and it's the last song in Book 2, Chapter 8. So if you look at this right away, we don't really see it referring to anything indirectly, but the reality it is. If you notice, it says what governs the earth, sea, and sky is love. What it's really trying to say is that's the force moving the earth, sea, and sky, like a physical force. But where is this coming from? It's actually coming from an ancient philosopher named Empedocles. He thought that there were two forces in the universe, love and hate. He thought love was the force that brought things together, so made the different elements, the compounds. You get the atoms becoming molecules, then the molecules becoming compounds, and all these different things that we have in the universe. That force that brings them together is love. That's what he thought. And he thought hate was the force that separated things, that broke compounds and molecules down into small objects and then became useless. We know differently now using modern science, but that's what he thought. So this poem, this song, is actually a literary allusion. It's referring to the works of Empedocles. Notice here, read it again, based in the light of that understanding. What governs earth and sea and sky is nothing less than love, whose tight rein, if it ever slackened, so it got lazy, did not do its work, would leave creation, that's the whole universe, in chaos of civil war's utter ruin. Because then the hate, the destructive force, would cause all things in the universe to fall apart. So it's like a civil war. It's like the universe is acting against itself. So this one is a really difficult illusion to recognize, because most people have not read Empedocles the philosopher, or are familiar with his ideas. But this is a book of philosophy, The Consolation of Philosophy, and it makes sense that it would indirectly refer to an ancient philosophy like that. So how do we identify illusions? Again, there's no clear way if you are learning them for the first time. Except you need to know your culture very well. And you need to be well read. Not having the above will make it very difficult to identify illusions. You have to have a very large background in order to do so. So if we look at this example, Bob was a real Scrooge. Quite a few of you are recognizing where this is coming from, because you're familiar with this book called A Christmas Carol, because you've probably seen a movie version of it. Scrooge is the main character in that book, and he's very greedy. He doesn't even want to give a dime to people who are in need. But he changes toward the end and becomes generous. So what they're trying to say about Bob here is he's very greedy. You don't use it in a positive way, because through most of the story, Scrooge is quite greedy. That's the extra meaning. Now, why do authors and writers use allusions? It's for several reasons. Number one, it appeals, or it means to speak to interests, beliefs, or strong feelings that you may have. But it appeals to your prior knowledge in order to connect it to the point the author is trying to make. That way you build a connection. That way you start getting into the book that you're reading or the speech that you're listening to. This connection makes the point stronger. So the author's point becomes much stronger when it's connected to your prior knowledge, and illusions can do that. Illusions also help you understand new or hard ideas, and it can convince you to agree with what the author says. And it can create feelings in the reader or listener. Actually, all types of feelings: joy, happiness, fear, anger, hatred, sympathy, and so on. Now, in order for you to understand why the illusion is being used in the first place and what the author is trying to get you to understand by using it, stop and ask yourself these questions. What does the writer want me to understand or think about this situation, event, character, or place? Did the author use this illusion to create a feeling or mood, a comedic effect, or to show the character's motives? Now, allusions are not inside jokes. They're not references only a few people would understand. They're a bit wider than that. They refer to biblical, or historical, or literary, or cultural, or mythological themes, people, or events. Those are very widely known. They are not inside jokes. They are things that are written down, or filmed, or so on. Here's an example from mythology. Gambling was his Achilles' heel. Achilles is the hero of the epic poem The Iliad, which is the prequel to the Odyssey. Achilles was a half-god, half-man, and he was invincible because he was dipped into a river. When he was dipped into the river, every part of his body that was dipped was invincible. But his heel was not dipped into the river. What happened in the poem? He got shot in his heel with an arrow, and he died because of that. He bled out. So saying something is an Achilles' heel is saying it's its only weakness. So this person who's gambling will bring himself down. That is his Achilles' heel. That is his flaw. That is where he can be hurt. So gambling will bring this man down. Trivia. Well, the word illusion is a Latin word, which means to hint or to suggest. Because, since an illusion is indirect, it hints at another source of information while not stating what that source is. It suggests it to you. It hints it. Makes you think to look elsewhere. It gets you to think. And if you're familiar with it, you'll figure out what it's alluding to. One last example. When you are angry, do you become a big green monster? And most of you have noticed what this is referring to. It's referring to Dr. Bruce Banner, who becomes the Hulk when angered. The idea that it's trying to get across is that the person asking is wondering if you become very violent when angered. It is a cultural illusion because it's referring to comic books and movies. It gets an idea into you that's kind of comedic at one point, but also kind of confusing at another. Well, I'm not that angry, but it makes a connection. It makes things very clear to you because you are familiar with the Hulk and how he can become very destructive when angered. For more videos, click here. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Metonymy. What is metonymy? Metonymy is a figure of speech where a thing is referred to by the name of a closely associated thing. Think about it this way. Metonymy is where the name of a closely associated thing replaces the actual name of an object. Now, whenever we find an example of metonymy, we call it a metonym. We don't say this is a metonymy, we say this is a metonym. Now, if you're a bit confused right now about what this is, let me give you an example. Here's the first example. Let me give you a hand. A hand here is a metonym. Why? Because it really means help. Let me help you. So hand here is a word that's closely associated with help, and it replaces the word help. So this is an example of metonymy. Example number 2. Hollywood has been making some very expensive movies recently. Hollywood here is the metonym. Why? Because not all movies are made in Hollywood, but Hollywood is closely associated with the film industry. So what they're trying to say here is the film industry has been making some very expensive movies recently, but Hollywood replaces the words film industry because it's the metonym. It's that word that's closely associated with the film industry. How do we use metonymy? Well, number 1, we have to think of an object that we want to describe. Then we think about a word that's closely associated with that object. Then we call the first object using the word that is closely associated with it. So if I want to talk about the power of words and ideas and books compared to the power of war and the military, I can say it this way. The pen is mightier than the sword. Here we have 2 metonyms, pen and sword. Pen is a metonym and it's replacing words and ideas, or even books. And sword is a metonym replacing war and military force. So what this sentence is saying, the pen is mightier than the sword, it's really saying that books, ideas, words, they're more powerful than war and military force. Because if you're able to convince an entire group of people of a certain idea, then no matter how much fighting happens, people will not really abandon the idea. They will still hold the idea. And even at that point, maybe war will not be necessary. Example number 4. The White House released a statement today. Here, the White House is the metonym, because it's replacing the president and his administration. The White House is a house. It doesn't do anything except sit there and have people live in it. But the idea is the White House is very closely associated with the president because he lives there, and his team, the administration, they work there. So when you say the White House released a statement today, you're meaning the president and his administration released a statement. So White House is the metonym. Trivia. Well, metonymy is a Greek word which means a change of name. Why? Because it refers to one object using another word, or the name of another object, to refer to the first object. So it refers to the first object using the name of another object. Like this one. The only way you can assemble a bookshelf is by sweat. Well, sweat here is a metonym. It is not literal, because sweat replaces hard work. So the only way you can assemble a bookshelf is by sweat. So the only way you can assemble a bookshelf is by hard work. Sweat is the metonym. You can click here to watch more videos on figurative language. Thanks for watching. Until next time.
What is a morpheme? Well, let's have a look at an example. Cherry trees. This is a word. It consists of morphemes. But what are these? Well, cherry, tree, and s. Those are the morphemes in cherry tree. Why are they the morphemes? Well, they are the elements that have meaning. We can divide them up into cherry, which is a fruit, tree, which is a big green thing, unless it's winter, and s, which kind of means something like plural, more than one. Okay, so a morpheme can be defined as the smallest meaningful unit, the smallest element that has meaning. And the s has meaning, it means the plural. In this case, the smallest meaningful unit is just one letter, it's just one sound. In the case of cherry, it's more than one letter, more than one sound. Cherry as a whole means cherry, a fruit, whereas the Y of cherry doesn't really mean anything. And likewise, tree as a whole means the thing that has leaves in the summer, whereas tr or any other element of it doesn't really mean anything. So cherry is the smallest meaningful unit, and tree is the smallest meaningful unit of those elements. Right, we can divide morphemes up into free morphemes, those that can appear on their own, like cherry and tree. They can just stand on their own, they can be words in their own right. And then there are those morphemes that can't, and we call them bound morphemes. These usually have to be attached to something else in order to make sense. So, s, if we just said s, it wouldn't mean anything, it wouldn't mean plural, it wouldn't mean more than one. But rather, the s will have to be attached to something else. And that's why we usually use a dash before the s to indicate that it needs to be attached to something else, so come after something else. And in this case, it needs to be attached to a noun, cherry trees. Right, the convention with the dash is that it appears where an element is attached. So in the case of the s, it has to be attached at the back of something. But there are other elements that are attached elsewhere. So where can morphemes appear? We've seen cherry trees, the s appears at the end, but there are also other elements where bound morphemes appear elsewhere. So in unreliable, the bound morpheme un appears before reliable. And in fun, bleeding, tastic, and other swear words, we find that the bound morpheme or the element appears in the middle of a word, in the middle of a root. Right, so we really have to see where an element appears in relation to the root, in relation to the element it attaches to, and that's how we can then distinguish different types of morphemes. So when something comes after the element it attaches to, it is a suffix. When something appears before the element it attaches to, it is a prefix. And when something appears in the middle of a root, as in fanbleeding-tastic, it is an infix. And there are many worse infixes in English. I think this is probably the lightest one we could find. Right, so let's have a look at the functions of morphemes. Morphemes also have functions, and some of those can be lexical, they can convey meaning. But morphemes can also have grammatical functions, expressing grammar. And here we can distinguish between derivation and inflection, and lexicon and grammar. And derivation and inflection is usually something we talk about when we talk about bound morphemes. Lexicon and grammar is usually something we talk about when we talk about free morphemes. But that's a whole different story and not part of this video. Thanks for listening. Right, let's have a look at morphemes and allomorphs, and really focusing on allomorphs here. There's a separate video on morphemes if you need some more information. But let's start with defining what a morpheme is. It is the smallest meaningful unit. And within the smallest meaningful unit, we can find some kind of variation, which is what we call allomorphy. Now, what are allomorphs? Let's have a look at some examples. A house, an apple. In this case, a and an are both indefinite articles. They both appear with house and apple to mark indefiniteness in a way. Do they have different meanings as such? Not really, right? I mean, a and an are just indefinite articles, and that's it. What's different between them is that a appears without an an, and also that they have different distributions, so they look differently because of the place where they appear. And this has to do with the sounds around them. The reasons for why they look different have to do with the phonological environment. Now, when a appears before a consonant, the form is a, whereas when this indefinite article appears before a word that starts in a vowel, the form is an. So a house, an apple. And this really relates to the way in which words are spoken. So when we have a word like honor, the form is an honor and not a honor, because honor is pronounced with an O. Okay, it might be written with an H in the beginning, but it is pronounced with an O first. Okay, so the way we relate to this, what we say about this, is that a and an are allomorphs of the same morpheme. There is variation in this morpheme. And the most basic form of the morpheme, the one that appears in most places, the one that we would look up in a dictionary, is the form a. So we could in this way say that a and an are allomorphs of the morpheme a, the general form, the most basic one. Okay, let's have a look at some other allomorphs. Some allomorphs don't appear in writing, they only appear in the spoken language. So if we take the definite article in this case, the house and the apple, now these are pronounced differently, even though they're not written differently. So you can see that in the IPA they would be written the and the, but in writing the form is just there. So in this case, allomorphy exists in the sounds and not really in the way the definite article is written. And there are yet other allomorphs that have nothing to do with the phonological environment, but rather have something to do with language change. Now, language changes over time, sounds develop, but we also borrow words from other languages into English. And we have some allomorphy that is due to this type of change. So children, the plural of child, ends in ren. The plural of house ends in an s. And, well, antenna is antennae. That's yet a totally different form of the plural. Now, in this case, there's nothing phonological that determines whether it's ren, s, or e. Okay, we could say child's, works perfectly well, but it doesn't. The form is children. Now, what this is language change over time. In children, this ren or n plural form is actually an Old English plural form that has survived, the Old English weak plural. In houses, the s is our regular plural form that appears with most types of plural nouns. And antennae, the e that appears after antenna, is the plural form of a loanword. Now, antenna is one of those very typical Latin Greek loans that we've got in English that have been borrowed both with their singular and their plural forms. And this is actually the plural form of another language, not the plural form of English. So in these cases, the plural forms are not phonologically determined. We don't have allomorphy due to phonological reasons, but rather allomorphy in these cases exists due to historical reasons. Right, a summary. We said morphemes are the smallest meaningful units, and allomorphs is variation within morphemes. Allomorphs are different forms within the same morpheme. And we distinguished between two different types of allomorphs, namely those that appear in specific phonological environments, so due to different sounds, and those that appear due to the history of the language or loanwords. Thank you very much.
Phonemes and allophones in English pronunciation. A phoneme is the smallest unit of speech sound. The word pool has 3 phonemes, p, oo, and ul. Each phoneme in a language has variants. These variants are called allophones. For example, in the word pool, the p must be pronounced using the correct allophone. In English, there are several allophones for p. Only one of the allophones of p is correct in the word pool. To pronounce pool in English, the correct allophone of p is aspirated. The aspirated allophone has a brief puff of air. With an incorrect allophone of p, it sounds like this: pool. With the correct aspirated allophone of p, it sounds like this: pool. Incorrect: pool. Correct: pool. Whenever p is before a vowel at the beginning of a stressed syllable, we use the aspirated allophone of p. Pie, pear, appear, patient. On the other hand, when the p is at the beginning of an unstressed syllable, we use the unaspirated allophone of p. Apple, polite, copper, typing. Similarly, in English, whenever the p sound comes after the sound s, we use the unaspirated allophone, not the aspirated allophone. We say spin, not spin. We say spool, not spool. We say speak, not speak. We say Spanish, not Spanish. Why is it so important to use the correct allophones when pronouncing English? If you use the incorrect allophones, people may sometimes misunderstand you, and you won't sound natural as an English speaker. Thank you for watching this video. For additional free tutorials, or to learn more about training programs in English pronunciation, visit www.confidentspeech.com.
What's the difference between inflection and derivation? Let's have a look at some examples. Trees consists of two morphemes, tree and s. Walked consists of two morphemes as well, walk and ed. Writer consists of write and r. And unlikely, well, consists of un and like and ly. But in this case, unlikely, we're just going to focus on these two elements, un and likely. Let's look at these in pairs. The first two of our examples, trees and walked, can be divided up in the following way. Tree is a noun and s is a plural marker. Walk is a verb and ed is the marker for the past tense. These are grammatical elements. Now the other two examples are quite different. Writer consists of a verb to write and of some sort of element er or r that indicates that this is a noun. So write, the verb, turns into a noun, a writer. It's a change in word class. Unlikely similarly changes meaning. So likely is an adjective, a likely event. An unlikely event is a totally different thing. It's still an adjective, but the meaning is now the opposite. So likely and unlikely differ in meaning, even though they don't differ in word class. Right, so let's start with our grammatical morphemes. This is what we call inflection. The grammatical morphemes do not change the meaning. Rather, they add some sort of grammatical information, as in ed, the past tense, in walked, or the s of houses or apples, the s adding to a noun that indicates plural. And there are lots of other categories that we could list here that would fall under the heading of inflection. Now, the other types of elements, those morphemes that indicate lexical meaning, are called derivation. And these always change the meaning of the word they attach to. So in the case of write and writer, we had a change from an action to a person who's doing that action. And in the case of likely and unlikely, we had the change from something positive to something negative. Now, derivation can also change the word class, but doesn't always have to do so. So likely, unlikely remain adjectives, even though there is derivation, whereas write, writer, we see a change in the word class from the verb to write to the noun writer. And that's basically it. Thank you very much for listening.
In propositional logic, disjunction is used to create a compound proposition which is false only if both propositions or disjuncts in it are false. It closely resembles or in natural language and is represented by the small letter v, going back to Latin vel. Here is a true example. Earth is a planet of the solar system or a satellite of the sun. If both disjuncts are true, as in our case, the disjunction is true too. But even if P is false and the Earth is not a planet, and Q is true, P or Q is true too. And similarly, if Q is false and the Earth is not a satellite of the Sun, the whole proposition, Earth is a planet or not a satellite of the Sun, is still true. Only if both propositions are false, that is, Earth is not a planet or not a satellite of the Sun, P or Q is false. Thus, the truth value of a complex proposition linked with or is determined by the truth values of its component propositions. It is true if at least one disjunct is true. This type of disjunction is referred to as inclusive disjunction. A stricter type of disjunction, often referred to as exclusive disjunction or short XOR, is true only if one of the disjuncts is true. It is symbolized by an encircled V. In natural language, XOR resembles either P or Q, whereas inclusive OR can be represented best as P or also Q. Logical equivalence is used to construct compound propositions which are true if all simple propositions have the same truth value. It is symbolized by the triple bar symbol, which is also used in maths to represent numerical equality, or by the double arrow. Here are two propositions. P, Earth is a planet. Q, Earth is a solar satellite. Both propositions are true. Using the other logical connectives, we can construct the following true statements. As a conjunction, P and Q is true. As an inclusive disjunction, P or Q is true. And using the negative operator, we can define not P and not Q is false, and not P or Q is also false. All those statements that have the same truth value can now be defined as logically equivalent. The statement P and Q is equivalent to P or Q is true, and the statement not P and not Q is equivalent to not P or Q is also true. So equivalence produces a value of true if and only if both propositions are true, or if and only if both propositions are false. Equivalent statements are important for the analysis of sentence meaning because they can freely replace one another without affecting the truth value.
Phonological rules. Phonological rules is a speech processes which happen naturally that can be understood by both speakers and listeners, and how speech sounds form pattern is made. There are four types of phonological rules. The first one is assimilation, dissimilation, insertion, and deletion. Assimilation. Assimilation is when a sound becomes more like a neighboring sound with respect to some phonetic property. Example: winter becomes winner, center becomes center, planter becomes planner. There are two major categories of assimilation. There are regressive assimilation. The phonem that comes first is affected by the one that comes after it. Example: bad boy becomes bad boy. Progressive assimilation. The phonem that follows is affected by the one that comes before it. Example: stand there becomes stander. Dissimilation. Dissimilation is a rule in which a segment becomes less similar to another segment. Example: the fricative becomes dissimilar to the preceding fricative by becoming a start. The word sick becomes to be pronounced as if they were spelled sick. English adapted the French word marble meaning marble, and in doing so dissimilated the second R to an O.
Deletion is removing a segment from certain phonetic context. For example, bomb and cramp. Bomb is written as B-O-M-B, but it pronounced without B in the end. This is also happened in cramp. From the example, we can find a rule. The rule is delete a word final P when it occurs after an M. Another example is sign and paradigm. Sign is written as S-I-G-N, but it pronounced without k sound. From the example, the rule is delete a k when it occurs before a word finally. Insertion is the process of inserting a syllabic or non-syllabic segment. It is also known as an epenthesis. The example of insertion is film, ankle, and hamster. Film is written as F-I-L-M.
Just me and my guitar.
Hello, I'm Sammy and I like to practice American English. This is part 1 of the Connected Speech series. Today, we'll discuss elision. What is elision? It means omitting one or more sounds in a word or phrase to make it easier to pronounce. This is used in casual, informal speech. Elision can help your American English sound smoother and more natural. American English has a few patterns of elision in casual speech, but today we will practice T and D elision. What do you notice about the pronunciation of the underlined words in this sentence? Formal speech. The handsome movie star acts in a film about friendship between a father and son. Now in casual speech. The handsome movie star acts in a film about friendship between a father and son. Whenever T or D comes between two consonants at the end of a syllable, it gets elided, which means that it doesn't get pronounced. For example, instead of scripts, we say scripts. And instead of friendship, we say friendship. Let's practice pronouncing the following words using T and D elision. Scripts, acts, facts, dialects, attempts, postcard, handsome, friendship, highlands. T and D elision can even happen between two words. For example, you pronounce last chance instead of last chance because the T does not get pronounced. Other examples are father and son, handbag, most popular, left turn, first 3, next day. Let's practice. Read the following sentences and use T and D elision for the underlined sounds. I started a friendship with a handsome artist. He paints landscapes. For the past 3 years, he's worked hard and become successful. Now, his most famous painting is printed on postcards. Next time, we'll have part 2 of the Connected Speech series about informal contractions. This is American English. Thanks for watching.